Different names and terms in Qigong. That is going to be the topic of this episode of Qi Life. So this video is another request from someone who watches the channel, and I'm going to read it out as I sort of at least somewhat address the topic that they've asked for. So let me just get this here. All right, so what they asked was, you find a lot of names or terms when you start to delve into Qigong. Can you put them into some kind of framework or structure so to get your head around how they fit into, or not, the Qigong jigsaw of information? Here are the kind of things I'm thinking of. Tai Chi, Tai Chi Chuan, Neidan, Neigong, Ba Duan Jin, 8 brocades, Daoyin. That's the kind of thing I'm thinking of. Can you weave anything out of that? Yeah, so I can weave something out of that. It might not be the answer you're looking for, but hopefully it will be helpful. Because you will come across a lot of different and unfamiliar terminology when you start to get into Qigong, both just in your own practice, or if you're starting to do some research and reading different things, looking at different videos, seeing things that, different practices people are doing, or even just things that people talk about in relationship to Qigong. Which is natural, Qigong comes from a different culture, the Chinese culture, of course. So they have different words, different terms, different ways of framing things, sometimes different symbolism than maybe you're familiar with from your own culture. And then also it has a very, very long history. And so as part of that long history, there's lots of variation. There's lots of different versions of things, lots of different schools of thought and things like that. So what I'm going to talk about in this video is maybe more the nature of some of these different terms, and kind of a little bit of a framework of some of the things you may come across, or way to think about them. Because there's way, way, way too many terms for me to actually go through comprehensively and try to list them all and say this means this and this means this and so on. But I can maybe give you a framework and also refer you to that for quite a few of these individual terms, or quite a few, at least some of them. I've already made vlogs on some of these, and I will continue to make vlogs on other ones in the future, I'm sure, because one of the things that I quite like to do is help people to understand about Qigong, about the general framework, history, context of it, so that they're in a better position to have a more solid understanding for themselves. So actually, some of the ones that you listed here, let me find it again. Let's hang on, give me a moment, get this open. Yeah, so some of the terms you listed: Tai Chi and Tai Chi Chuan. I've already done a vlog on that. Neidan and Neigong, I've done one on that. Ba Duan Jin and 8 brocades, I've done one on that. Haven't done one on Daoyin. And a bunch of other terms as well. So you might want to look back at other vlogs for individual terms. But yeah, and future ones as well. But I will give you a bit of a framework around just understanding some of what you may encounter. One of the things that can be extra confusing when you're looking at different terms in relationship to Qigong is you'll find the same term spelt differently. And if you're not familiar with those two different ways of spelling, this is in terms of spelling in the English language, generally in the Chinese characters. Well, actually, even in the Chinese characters, they can be spelt differently for a couple of reasons. One, there's traditional Chinese characters and then more modern, simplified Chinese characters. And so you might see something in the traditional, or you might see it in the simplified, and without an understanding of that, you might think it's different words, but it's actually the same word. And then in addition to that, sometimes there are different characters for the same word as well. Generally in the modern context, there's one that's used by far most commonly, but sometimes there's also a more ancient version that will occur sometimes when someone is wanting to draw out a particular meaning, a nuance or context around the use of that word. So, even in Chinese characters, you can see things kind of spelt differently or using different characters. And certainly when it's translated through into English, or transliterated rather than translated, there are different methods of transliteration. So, a lot of the older texts used the Wade-Giles system. And so an example of, so for Qigong, for example, of how that would be spelt in Wade-Giles is it would be C-H-I for Qi and K-U-N-G for Gong. Okay? Whereas there's another system which is far more common in more recent times. It is the official way of Romanizing, transliterating Chinese words in the modern era, which is Pinyin. And so to spell Qigong in Pinyin, it's Q-I for Qi and G-O-N-G for Gong. So yeah, the Wade-Giles method of transliteration more closely aligns with like the Cantonese dialects, the way that they pronounce the words. And so if you're wanting to say it more in a sort of Cantonese or Southern dialect sort of way, using that transliteration is going to bring that out more clearly. Whereas the Pinyin, some of it's actually just a little bit confusing in terms of how do I pronounce that until you become familiar with it. And when you are familiar with it, it aligns a bit better with Mandarin, which of course is the most common Chinese dialect, certainly at this point. And so it aligns with that. So in almost all modern text, you should be seeing words transliterated using Pinyin, using that standard form of spelling. But there's lots of older things that people wrote about Qigong as it came into the West. And Wade-Giles was used a lot for that. And people who have continued to practice Qigong, based on those sources, some of them will continue to use that type of spelling, even though it's not really a standard or normal thing to do at this point. To make things even more confusing, there's a bunch of people out there, and I think this is becoming less common as well, but certainly going back a little while, there was, quite a few people who just came up with their own way of transliterating things. And so you'll see these really odd spellings of things where they just like, it kind of sounds like this. And they've spelt it the way that they think, just that it sounds like, not a standard spelling at all. Which can really really lead to a little bit of confusing if you're looking at some of these different sources. With enough experience, you find your way through this and you can recognize, oh yeah, that's that term, it's just in Wade-Giles. That's that term, it's just in Pinyin. That's just, from context, you know what they're talking about, but they just came up with that themselves, Although it's quite interesting, sometimes in terms of some of these unusual spellings, I've seen some quite funny ones where someone has, again, it's this thing of things as they get passed down, being changed and, according to people's own understanding, where, quite a standard common term, well, within Qigong at least, common term, and someone has obviously taken it from one source and not understood it, and then just come up with their own version of that same term, and they're clearly talking about the same thing, but they've kind of worked with it phonetically and haven't quite understood and they've come up with like a really different word for it, or meaning, different word, maybe based on a phonetic misunderstanding of an earlier word. So that can be quite interesting as well. So that's one thing to get your head around when you're looking at these different terms. Another thing to be aware of is also, I guess similar to the example that I was just mentioning, it was, someone just phonetically misunderstanding something and coming up with their own different version of it, is there are actually also often lots of different terms that, for the same thing, where, and sometimes the terms are just slightly different, someone's just calling it a little bit different. So maybe an example of that is So one quite famous Qigong exercise, which is riding a horse using a bow and arrow to shoot the eagle. And some people will just refer to it as the bow and arrow. Some people will specifically refer to a man riding a horse using a bow and arrow to shoot the eagle. Some people will refer to riding a horse using a bow and arrow to shoot a hawk. Just small differences, but clearly the same thing. But people have just emphasized or de-emphasized one or another part of the name. But then there's also ones that are much more different, where people have come up with quite different names, for the same practice, for the same concept, or things like that as well. And and if you don't have enough experience, enough context, you might be like, oh, someone's saying this, and think they're completely different things, when often they're actually just talking about the same thing. They're using different names. Another side to that, though, sometimes when people do use a different name, and even if it's about the same practice, it may be that they're using a different name because it's emphasizing a different aspect of the practice, or drawing something out more strongly within it. So, like a real simple example of this within some of the practices we do as part of the Long White Cloud Qigong curriculum. So there's one movement which is called breathing squats. And look, there's lots of different types of breathing squats. And there's one movement that we simply do as a breathing squat. And then we do the same movement sometimes and refer to it as bounding leopard. And because it's a particular type of breathing squat. And in some contexts, when we're using it, we're specifically wanting to bring through some specific qualities within that movement that has a resemblance to the movement of a leopard bounding across the plains. Other times when we're doing it as a breathing squat, we're not so concerned about those specific qualities, and there's different variations that we can do, and that'll be fine. That'll serve our purpose just fine. So, sometimes same exercise, different name for a specific reason. All right, so how can you think about all of these different terms that you're going to come across? Look, there's lots of them you're going to come across. I can't give you a comprehensive list, as I mentioned at the beginning. But just recognize you're going to come across lots of things. Hopefully this framework of understanding there are different spellings that might be the same word, there are different words that might be the same practice, is helpful to you to start to, find your way through some of these terms. And you can look for good sources to understand each term one by one as you come across them. Again, I've made vlogs on some of these that might help you with some context around some of them. Actually, one really simple source that is often quite good is Wikipedia. You can often find articles on some of these different concepts and terms in there. I certainly wouldn't take Wikipedia as a definitive answer on anything, because it is kind of a crowdsourced knowledge and you're going to get particular slants, and some of them may not be entirely accurate. But certainly it often is a really good starting point for understanding some of these different terms. So that can be good as well. All right, hopefully that is at least somewhat useful. I look forward to seeing you on another vlog soon.